Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for joining us for our 75th commemoration of D-Day. My name is Dr. Keith Hudson. I'm the Senior Director of Research and History in the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum. We'd like to start with our tradition of recognizing and thanking those who served during World War II abroad or on the home front. Are there any home front workers or World War II veterans in the audience? Could you please stand or wave your hand and be recognized? Also, are there any Holocaust survivors in our audience today? Lastly, any other military veterans in any of our other war periods or peacetime service? Thank you for your service. Today's program would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. A special thank you to D.G. Yingling and Son Incorporated, America's oldest brewery, family-owned and operated since 1829 and celebrating their 190th year in business. RPM Pizza, largest Domino pizza franchise in the U.S., located in Gulfport, Mississippi. Louisiana Fire Extinguishers Incorporated, a one-stop specialist in the prevention, detection, and extinction of fires. And Navy Federal Credit Union, with 8 million members, strives to serve and enrich the lives of those in the military community. Today's discussion, Depictions of D-Day, seeks to lay out some stories that are less familiar from the conventional narrative about D-Day, and it features 3 distinguished panelists. First, we'll hear from Linda Hervieux. She's a journalist and photographer whose work has appeared in publications including the New York Times, the New York Daily News, and the Daily Beast. Her book, Forgotten: The Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes, is a critically acclaimed blend of military and social history, a story that pays tribute to the valor of an African-American battalion whose crucial contributions on D-Day have gone unrecognized to this day. Drawing on newly uncovered military records and dozens of original interviews with surviving members of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion and their families, her book depicts a vivid account of the tension between racial politics and national service in wartime America. It's a moving narrative of human bravery and perseverance in the face of injustice. Next, we'll hear from Dauphine Sloan. Dauphine is Senior Professor of Practice teaching International Development at the Department of Political Science, Tulane University, and Director of the Payson Graduate Program in Global Development at Tulane University's Law School. She received her doctorate in sociology and her master's in applied modern languages, English and Russian, from the University of Paris, as well as a postgraduate degree in Soviet and Eastern European studies from the Institut Études Politiques de Paris. Dauphine's father, Guy de Montlaur, was a French commando on Sword Beach on June 6, 1944. His art and his wartime experience is currently on view here at the museum in an exhibit entitled, "In Memory of What I Cannot Say, The Art of Guy de Montlaur." Finally, we'll hear from Lieutenant Paul Reck. Lieutenant Reck started his career as a heavy weapons infantryman in the Marines in 1990. He transitioned to the Coast Guard in 1992 and trained as a corpsman. He reached the rating of Health Services Senior Chief, then Medical Administration Chief Warrant Officer, and finally, his current rank of lieutenant in Health Services Administration as a regional practice manager. Career highlights include his 2 cutters, 2 tours in Operation Iraqi Freedom, and most recently, medical unit leader for the Hurricanes Harvey and Michael responses and for the humanitarian mission at the southwestern border. Lieutenant Reck serves collaterally as a historian with the Coast Guard's Historian's Office covering the Gulf region. He holds a master's degree in military history from Norwich University. Now please join me in welcoming our first speaker.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. First, I'd like to just give a big thank you to all of the veterans who are here today. I've met so many men today who fought in many wars, a very dwindling number in World War II. We're losing them every day. It is an honor that you are with us, and thank you for protecting us and protecting freedom and democracy. Thank you to this wonderful museum. I've been wanting to come here for years, and I'm very happy to be here. It is extremely impressive, the job of preserving the memories, the memorabilia, the archives of the Second World War. Also to Dr. Keith Hudson for arranging this panel, for all of the volunteers who come to this museum and serve. I've met so many of you over 2 days. It's just very impressive, and I am very humbled to be here. No black soldiers landed on D-Day. And this is what I was told repeatedly as I was researching my book about D-Day's only African-American combat unit, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. This is a shot of, wait, how is this working? Okay. Oops. Oh, here we are. Okay, we're almost there. This is a shot of the 320th taken in Normandy in the summer of 1944. It was taken by a man I'll tell you a little bit more about later, George Davison. He liked to write on all of his pictures, and it was so thrilling to be given access to this collection and to see all the notes scrawled on the backs. There were 4 out of about 30 units that trained to fly barrage balloons in the United States Army during the war. What was interesting about the balloons is this was a top secret technology at the time. The camp where the balloons where the men were being trained to fly the balloons was in Tennessee, where they could be kept secret. And these were the men who were in charge. This is the headquarters battery, and they were in charge of inspecting the balloons, making sure they were up to speed. This is the only known photo in the national, or actually this is from the New York Public Library, of the balloons on tour. So the balloons, while the troops were training in Britain to fly these balloons just before the landings, these balloons went on tour, and this was taken in Washington, D.C. And you can see a very good close-up here of how, probably the best photo ever, of how the balloons worked. One man in the unit told me that it was about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, was about 125 pounds, filled with hydrogen. And these men were raising it up in Washington, D.C. This is the only known photo of the 320th on Omaha Beach from the National Archives. And the balloons were flown from the ground. A winch brought them up to 2,000 feet. And the idea was that these balloons would form an aerial curtain over the beaches. And so that when an enemy plane came, it would strafe the cable, and the cable, which was essentially a piano wire, was enough to shear off a wing. But the balloons had a secret weapon, and they had little bombs that were anchored underneath, about 4 pounds. They were British made. The Americans copied the formula, and the bombs would detach, they would lower down, and a good hit could explode the wing, explode the gas tank. And you can see here how they worked. So a parachute system would descend, and these balloons were extremely effective, and they only became defunct when the V-2 rockets were introduced at the end of the war. This is June 7th, 1944. You might recognize this picture. We don't often speak about June 7th. June 6th gets a lot of attention. But after the landings of these men, all of the balloons that you saw, some of these are flying over the ships, but all of the balloons that flew over Omaha and Utah beaches were flown by this battalion. And this is Camp Tyson, Tennessee. This is where the balloon flyers trained. This is in a corner of northwestern Tennessee. And what was interesting about this camp is it was built kind of slapdash, like a lot of some of the bases were just before or just after it was clear the U.S. was going to war. And these balloons were seen to be outside of the lanes of where enemy spies might see them. It was seen to be clear of other, other airways. And so the men who were here, and there were 30 battalions, the 320th the original size of the battalion was close to 1,100 men, and they learned to become basically weatherman experts. They learned how to make hydrogen, which is surprisingly easy to make, and they learned how they were going to be able to make it on the go. And the reason that they were sent to Normandy remains a mystery, but I will tell you that there were 3 batteries of white soldiers who were sent to the Italian campaign we don't hear much about. And these barrage balloon batteries were the first tests of the balloons in war. And they were deemed such a success that they were deemed to be part of they were worked into the Normandy battle plan. And so the first test was in November of 1943, Sicily in the Italian mainland. And what's interesting is if you speak to some of the veterans, I was able to find 12 men from this battalion who were still with us. And they told me that a few of them did not remember that there had been a whole separate part of the base where there had been white soldiers, because as most of you know, the United States Army was segregated at the time. And what did that mean? It meant that there were entirely separate barracks, mess halls, and the training was also segregated. And so the only part of the training that these men would have been integrated was an officer candidate school. And there were some men I'll tell you about later who made the cut for officer candidate school and who were in integrated training. And why were they in integrated training? Because frankly, the Army did not think that black men were smart enough to pass the entrance exam. It was an entrance exam heavily weighted to favor whites in their school learning. But we do have some men from this battalion who did pass that and who were involved in integrated training. But I'd like to introduce you to some men of the 320th. This morning, we spoke about their mission in general, but I think that on this anniversary of D-Day, the 75th anniversary, meeting some of the individual men, and one of them is still with us. He was on CNN this morning from Pittsburgh, where he lives. It has been just an honor to know them and to tell their stories. Here's another barrage balloon. And what I wanted to tell you about this one is this is about the size of 3 school buses. It was giant, and they were flown with with teams, 12 men or more. The balloons that went to Normandy could be flown with teams of 3. This is George Davison. Waynesburg, Pennsylvania. His son Bill has written tributes online to his father and has helped preserve the memory of the 320th. In the 1980s, George filled a notebook with his experiences in the war, with the D-Day landing, all written by hand. And those experiences are one of the few personal records of, that I could find as I began my research. This is Wilson Caldwell Monk. He came from Atlantic City, New Jersey. When I phoned him at home in Silver Spring, Maryland in 2010, he told me, "I've been waiting for someone to call me for 50 years. Now, that is not quite true. His son, over the years, had asked many times, you know, "Dad, will you tell me the story? Tell me some more stories." He wouldn't. And I think a lot of us know, veterans, my dad's a World War II veteran, a lot of veterans are very reluctant to share their stories, and sometimes as the years go by and age takes over and sometimes emotion takes over, we start to hear these stories if we're lucky. And so Wilson Monk had an interesting story. This battalion spent some months in Wales, and he was all but adopted by a Welsh woman whose son was away at war. And the correspondence between her and Wilson's mother back in Atlantic City would form a precious, precious record of sort of this kinsmanship between the countries during the war, and also some of the few letters left that I could find among the men of this battalion. And this is Wilson Monk and Martina at home in 2010. I would find the family that had sheltered him. I would find their grandchildren in Wales, and I called him, and it was only 3 days after he had died. So I never got to tell him that I was able to find his family. This is Henry Parham. I just mentioned Henry. He's the last of the veterans still with us today. He's 97. He's planning to attend D-Day commemorations today in Pittsburgh, where he lives with his wife, Ethel. He landed on Omaha Beach. And this is Henry at Allegheny Cemetery on Memorial Day 2011. This is William Dabney. He is wearing the French Legion of Honor, which the French government awarded to him in June 2009 on the 65th anniversary of D-Day. He was the only American veteran so honored. Meeting Bill and learning the story of the 320th through him inspired me to write this book. Bill was too young to serve, but he convinced his grandmother to sign his enlistment papers. He led a three-man balloon crew on Omaha Beach. And when I met him at 89, he was the baby of the battalion, the youngest one. This is Arthur Guest. Arthur Guest described his childhood as barely above the slavery line on a rented farm in South Carolina. He was drafted into the Army and landed on Utah Beach on D-Day, where he said, quote, "The bombs landed like raindrops." Samuel L. Madison grew up an orphan in Columbus, Ohio. He could never abide the explicit and hateful racism he experienced within the U.S. Army. He would break the fingers of a military police officer who harassed him. He would be court-martialed at least once, I could find, if not more, according to him. He was good at his job, though, and he would become a sergeant leading a balloon crew on Omaha Beach. And by the way, all of these men leading these crews, they landed with the infantry in 150 landing craft. And for all intents and purposes, until the small arms fire was cleared and they could get their balloons up, they were infantry, and they did what all the infantry soldiers did. They tried to round up the enemy. This is George Hamilton, one of two men from High Point, South Carolina, holding a picture of his war service. The men of the 320th, though, were not the only soldiers of color on the beach on D-Day. By nightfall on June 6, nearly 2,000 African-American troops had landed on the two beaches. Most of these troops were assigned to service and labor battalions, which were the jobs the Army disproportionately relegated to black soldiers. On Omaha, the Hollywood director John Ford, who came ashore with a Coast Guard crew, watched from a point of safety as a black soldier ferried supplies from a ship seemingly oblivious to the punishing machine gun fire that strafed the sand around him. Ford would later write in a memoir, "I thought, by God, if anybody deserves a medal, that man does." In fact, there were relatively few medals awarded to African American soldiers in World War II. There were no medals of honor given out until 1997, when President Clinton, acting on a recommendation of an independent panel of researchers, awarded 7 of them. That report found pervasive racism was to blame for denying black soldiers the decorations, the promotions, and the duties they deserved. One man who did not receive our nation's highest award was Waverly Woodsen. Waverly Woodsen was a 21-year-old medic, a corporal from West Philly, who splashed down in 4 feet of churning sea and waded toward Omaha Beach around 9 a.m. on the morning of June 6th. Woodsen was wounded, hit by burning shrapnel that raked his landing craft and ripped open his buttocks and thigh. The soldier next to him was killed along with the crew. A medic slapped dressings on Woodsen's wounds, and they, along with 3 other medics, crept up the beach, crouched behind a tank. They were the first African Americans I could find on Omaha Beach. For the next 30 hours, Woodsen would survive German snipers and his own searing pain to save scores of lives. Decades later, Woodsen would learn that he had been nominated for the Medal of Honor. There was a faded handwritten note tucked in a folder at the Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri, revealing that an American general in Britain believed Woodsen deserved better than the Distinguished Service Cross for which he had been recommended. In the end, he got a Bronze Star. Here is a Negro from Philadelphia who has been recommended for a suitable award, the unsigned note says. This is a big enough award that the president can give it personally, as he has in the case of some white boys. The writer, who is almost certainly Phileo Nash, an official in the Office of War Information, addressed his message to Jonathan, who we believe was Jonathan Daniels, his frequent correspondent and an aide to President Roosevelt. To the Army, this note is not enough, nor is an extraordinary Army press release from August 1944 lauding Woodsen for treating scores of men. The Army wants records, and Woodsen's files are missing, along with all but 1% of Army files from World War II. Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen Jr. has led the charge on Capitol Hill to persuade the Army to reconsider Woodsen's case. Woodsen's family has begun an online petition. This is Joanne Woodsen, Waverly Woodsen's wife at Arlington National Cemetery. She turned 90 last week. Every year around Memorial Day, she places his favorite red roses on his gravestone. He grew these in his retirement, also built the family stereo, won prizes for his roses, was very proud of them. A few weeks ago, Joanne told me 75 years is a long time to wait for justice. There are links to all of this on my website, which is my name, lindahervieux.com. Also a gallery to 320th men. 2 of the daughters of one 320th man who never told his family he landed at D-Day, who never told his family anything about his war service, heard about the book, and they came today from Baltimore. They were here this morning. And it's a privilege. So we will add their father, Frank Stockton, to the 320th gallery on my page, along with all the ones we can find who are still, whose families are, some of them just learning about what their fathers did for us and for freedom. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. This was a beautiful set of stories that you told us today. I also want to thank Keith for organizing our panel today, and of course the World War II Museum for organizing not only this whole series of events today, but this exhibit of my father's artwork, which is in the Louisiana Pavilion on the second floor, and which I hope you have seen, or maybe you will see in the next few days. So my name is Dauphine Sloan, my maiden name Dauphine de Montlaur, so the daughter of Guy de Montlaur. And I'm here today to tell you his story. And before I do so, I would like to show you a video, which it's a short video, a broadcast that was done for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, so back in 1994. It was done by CBS reporter Gordon Peterson, who went to Normandy and met my mother. He went to our house in Normandy, talked to her, and saw some of the beautiful paintings that my father had done in their house. And then they also went to Sword Beach in Ouistreham, which is the British beach at which my father landed on D-Day. So if the technicians would like to put on the video, we have time to do so now. Thank you.
She lives in the French countryside in Normandy. Her home is a 17th century farmhouse. It's a peaceful place, apparently untouched by 2 world wars and, 50 years ago, occupation by Hitler's armies. This one, the old one.
Now this one was painted in Nice in 1952, I think.
Although American by birth and citizenship, she is a countess. Her late husband was Count Guy de Montlaur, a gifted artist whose works fill their home. They are mostly abstract, very emotional. These are the paintings of a man who holds back nothing and who forgets nothing.
A few weeks before he died, he painted this with all the pain that he could possibly feel, and he understood very well what was going on.
Guy de Montlaur was also an authentic French hero of D-Day and the battles that followed it. This is how he described D-Day. At dawn on the 6th of June, 1944, 180 Frenchmen, Marine commandos, took part in Operation Overlord and were the first commandos to land at the extreme eastern flank of the Allied assault. He goes on to say, the commandos were the first French servicemen to have the honor of killing a certain number of the German soldiers then stationed in France. It is safe to say that in the entire D-Day invasion force, no one was more eager to set foot on French soil than Guy de Montlaur and his fellow commandos.
Why was it so important for your husband to be part of this invasion force?
He was a fighter. He wanted to, well, I won't say what he said, but he wanted to kick the people out. He didn't like his country to be occupied. It offended him personally. He didn't like seeing them go up the Champs-Élysées with their fife and drums and their goose steps. He didn't like it. It made him feel quite sick. He wanted to kick them out.
How long after D-Day was it before you heard from your husband and heard that he was all right?
I heard very quickly. They had a wonderful system. They were given little postcards where you just put an X in pencil, I am okay, or I am wounded, or whatever, and he put an X, I am okay.
What impact did this experience have on your husband for the rest of his life?
He had nightmares. He, in the beginning, during the night, while he was sleeping, he would scream at times, because he never did that during the war. He was very calm.
How about his paintings? Did the experience go into his art?
It did very much so. Many of the titles show that, for instance, Midsummer in Normandy or A Night in Normandy. Many of his paintings have the title, and you can see sort of a spray of tracer bullets, and you don't know what they are because it's abstract. But he said, if you knew what was in these paintings, and he meant the really gruesome-looking ones, if you knew what they were about, you wouldn't be able to look at them. This is called the irrefutable truth.
I suppose after this anniversary now, the memory of this will slowly fade away. What do you think?
Well, maybe the memory of the men who were actually there will fade away, because they will fade away eventually. But their families will remember. It'll carry on, don't you worry. It's very, very ingrained, especially in Normandy.
Thank you. All right, so it is 25 years later, and my mother was right. We're still remembering. So I'm here today to tell you the story of my father. His dearest wish since he was a child was to defend his country. And he had very good models before him, his own father, his uncles had fought in World War I. His father's life was cut short at the age of 50 because he had been gassed by mustard gases during World War I. So this was something that for him was perfectly normal. There would be at some point a war, unfortunately, with our neighbor, Germany. This is also a story of courage, and we heard from Linda some very important stories of courage that were not necessarily recognized in time, but that are now recognized. And I'm sure that there are many more that we need to hear about. So my father expressed his feelings and his memories of the war through painting. It was very difficult for him, just as Linda said, as well as for a lot of veterans to talk about these experiences. So he was in a way lucky to have this talent, this artist talent, to be able to tell his story through painting. So this is him right after World War II, when his mother made him wear his uniform again for the picture. And he's wearing his medals, the Légion d'honneur, just like the soldier that Linda showed us on the left, and the Médaille Militaire. And here is my mother, whom you saw a number of years later, Adelaide Piper Oates. She was from New York. Here they are again, but this time in art form. The portrait on the left was done by my father when he was on the front. He was in the northeast of France, in Lorraine, and he did this pencil drawing and sent it to his mother, and we got it back a number of years later. The portrait on the right is of my mother. My father painted it in 1948 when they were living in Connecticut. They had met 7 years earlier, 7 years before D-Day, that is, in 1937. My mother was a young American, 17 years old, wanting to study art in Paris. My father was studying art himself, so that's where they met, in art school. He was also studying philosophy at the Sorbonne, which you see in the picture on the bottom right. And I put that picture of the World Exposition 1937 up there because they actually went to this exposition together. And the picture is taken, as you can see, right in front of the Eiffel Tower at the Trocadero. So these were, you know, it was 2 years before World War II started, and everything was very pleasant. She was 17, he was 18, and they were certainly already very much in love. Meanwhile, though, World War II was brewing in the East. And this is, of course, a map of Europe with a very large Germany, the German Reich, which, as you know, is going to start expanding to the west and then later on to the east. So the story of my father is really a story, it's kind of a double, dual story of a soldier and a story of an artist. So this picture was taken in Holland in November 1944, and I'll tell you in a few minutes what happened there. But I just want to give you a little bit of background on the early days of the war in terms of what happened to him, what happened to Guy de Montlaur, or what he made happen. So in 1938, he was just finished with his studies. He had completed his bachelor's in philosophy at the Sorbonne, and he now had to do his military service. At the time, military service in France was 18 to 24 months, I don't know exactly, but longer than it was afterwards. He was sent to Lorraine, so to the northeast of France, just at the border with Germany. So that when World War II started, and of course it started in installments, as you all know, with first the Anschluss in Austria, and then the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938, and then finally the invasion of Poland in 1939. And that was the time when France and the United Kingdom declared war to Germany. So my father is right there at the front when World War II starts. And rather than just waiting for something to happen, his regiment joined something called the Corps Franc. And the Corps Franc is a bit like a commando unit, a little bit like your Marines here in the United States. And the Corps Franc would do a number of incursions through the German border, where they would face the German Corps Franc, or the equivalent type of commandos from Germany. So there was a lot of fighting, which we don't hear very much about. All we hear about is the phony war, right? The war that wasn't really, where nothing was really happening, where the Germans were waiting, the French were waiting. So we think nothing happened, but it's not true. There were a lot of raids across that border. But then finally, unfortunately, France, together with Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, all 4 countries were invaded by the German army in one day, on May 10th, 1940. Very soon thereafter, about 10 weeks later, the armistice was signed by France and Germany. So that's a very brief timeline just to set the context. So what was one to do, right? You go back home and you wait for things to happen. What do? You lead a normal life, or maybe you choose to resist, right? And so most of you, I'm sure, know about the famous Appel du 18 juin, which was when General de Gaulle was already in London and spoke on the BBC and called the French to resist. Very few French people heard this appeal. But word of mouth worked. And little by little, people started thinking, all right, I'm going to resist from the inside, join the French resistance, or maybe I'm going to go to North Africa, which of course was still a French colony at the time, or I might go to England and join the Free French. So, this is what de Gaulle said, France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. That was kind of the motto. Yes, we were invaded, and yes, the German army was stronger than the French army, but it's not over. The war is not over. Very difficult to imagine when you see, this map to me looks like this, huge octopus with its arms, reaching out to various countries in the north, in the east, in the south, and the west. So, it's probably very difficult for citizens of those countries to really know what to do. France itself, as you know, was occupied right after May 10th. Part of France was occupied by the Germans until November 1942. And then from 1942 until the end of the war, the whole country was occupied. So meanwhile, where is Guy de Montlaur, right? So you remember, he's in Lorraine, so northeast of France. When the invasion happens, his unit retreats towards the south, and they end up in the southwest of France, in the so-called zone libre, so the free zone that is unoccupied by the Germans. They stay there for a while. Eventually, the unit is demobilized, and my father thinks, okay, what am I going to do now? And he thought, because he had been fighting with the Corps Franc, he knew how, as he would say, he knew how to do it. He knew that he knew how to fight. And so he thought, my best bet is to go to England, join the Free French, and at some point, hopefully, there will be an invasion of France and we'll be able to push back the enemy. So he gets to England, he meets de Gaulle, like every French man arriving in England had to meet de Gaulle, and then he hears about this commando unit that is training in Scotland, that is headed by Philippe Keffer, Commando Keffer. But all of this unit is under British command. And the British really created these commando units, which then will be taken as a model for the US Marines. So that really comes from the British. So my father is the soldier on the right in the front row. And this is a review by Philippe Keffer, who's on the right, dressed just like the other commandos. And then the man in the naval officer uniform was the head of the FNFL. FNFL was the Force Navale France Libre. so the Free French Naval Forces. So this is a review taking place in the fall of 1942 when my father had just joined the unit. And by the way, just to go back to the slide, as you can see on the right, the French were dressed just like the British commandos. The only thing that made them different was that little sign saying France on their shoulder. But everything else was just the same as the French. These pictures were taken in Aknakari, and I probably am not pronouncing this name well, but this is in Scotland. This is where they train. My father used to say that the training was much harder than the war itself. He was very scared of heights, so he didn't like this kind of exercise. But, you know, if you wanted to be a commando, if you wanted to earn the Green Beret, you had to go through this very tough training. Once they had trained and succeeded and, you know, passed this training, they would receive the Green Beret. And then a lot of them went on raids to the north of France. So they were either, again, incursions to fight Germans there, or they were reconnaissance raids, meaning, you know, people, units trying to figure out how the Germans were defending, the French coasts. The Germans were not crazy, you know, they knew that it was very possible that there would be an invasion by the Allies at some point. And so they defended all of the borders of France, and especially the coast of Normandy and Brittany. So there were bunkers, blockhouses, walls, what have you, mines, of course, on the beaches, all around the coast of France. And nobody could go to the beach in those days. That was forbidden. All of the borders were closed to French citizens, especially after November 1942. So this is one of my father's dear friends and comrades from the French Commando Unit. His name is Pierre Valron. He went on such a reconnaissance raid in the north of France and was killed there. And from sorting a lot of the writings that my father did, he had a lot of insomnia, so he would write a lot, especially at night. Through some of his writings, we learned that when he painted this beautiful portrait of Pierre Valron, he had just had a dream of him. This is 1968, so it's 24 years after D-Day, and it's 25 years after Pierre Valron was killed. He has this very vivid dream about his friend, and so right away he gets up and he paints this portrait. So that is just one example of what he could do with his art. So you all know about D-Day, so I'm not going to explain what happened there. I just put this picture, this map here, so you would see where the British landed. My father's unit was part of the British command that landed at Sword Beach. So that's the easternmost beach right there. And they, this is, of course, his impression of the beach. It's called Composition Plage in French, Composition Beach, which he did a number of years later in a very sort of almost cubist type of art. His art evolved, you know, through different ways, and this particular painting is very structured. But then things change a little bit, and it sort of explodes, right? This painting is called Fire, or Feu in French. And again, from his writings, we learn that he's finally getting rid of this carcan, he says in French, this structure, both maybe in his mind and maybe in the way that he learned the techniques of painting when he was very young. You can see this, these two paintings actually at the World War II Museum exhibit. And then this one was done much later in the 70s. So this is only 5 years before he died. And again, here it seems that his art has exploded even more and has gotten its freedom that he was looking for so many years. As my mother said in the broadcast that you saw earlier, a lot of his paintings have titles that tell you what he had in mind when he was painting. This one is 1 June early morning. There are many that have very similar titles. 2 minutes, okay, I'm gonna hurry. Just so you know, so the French unit had a twofold mission. First mission was to take the so-called casino. So on the top right, you can see a German bunker. This was nicknamed the casino because actually there was a real casino there before the war. So they were to take the casino and eventually make their way to what is now called Pegasus Bridge, which was at the time the bridge of Bénouville, which was a little further down, and rally the British paratroopers who had landed there, or had jumped and landed there during the night. Both missions were a success. They were very difficult, of course, but they were both a success. So these are pictures of Pegasus Bridge on the right, and on the left, a painting by my father called Pegasus Before Landing. He really liked to play with words. So it's both Pegasus. Pegasus was the nickname of the British paratrooper unit that landed that night, hence the name of the bridge. And of course, Pegasus Before Landing. If you look carefully, you might be able to see a winged horse. On that painting, you might be able to see also some explosions in the background and maybe a ship sinking. It's abstract art, so you really can see whatever you want, and that's what he used to tell us. You know, you don't have to know what I had in mind. You can just decide whatever you want. So I'm going to skip this just to go to the family history. The unit, my father and his unit spent almost 3 months, 78 days in the Battle of Normandy. So again, just as in Linda's story, it's not just June 6th, it's June 7th, it's almost 3 months of constant fighting with no relief, no leave, nothing. And a bit of a trench war too. So very, very difficult, very stressful. Finally, at the end of August, they're able to all go back to England on leave, get some rest, and he gets to meet his firstborn daughter, born August 10th. So he sees her when she's about 2 weeks old. That's on the day of her baptism. And he's there with my mother on the left. And I'm going to skip the Holland part because I guess we don't have time, right? But just a few more I think this quote is important. So I'm going to read it to you and maybe finish on now. I want to shout, just look at this mystery. It pierces the eyes. And nobody sees it, nobody but me. People see colors, shadows, lights, forms. They see the canvas, the stretcher nails, and I don't understand why they can't guess at all the distress here, right in front of them, as it was during the war. The noise, death, love, betrayal, the lies and the fear, and still more that I cannot say. But I know how to do it. Yes, I know how to do it. You will find a few of these on the table over there if you're interested. These have the pictures of all the paintings that are exhibited here at the museum. Thank you very much.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lieutenant Shannon Paul Reck. First off, I want to thank Dr. Hudson and the World War II Museum for allowing me to come speak to y'all. So as you can see by the slide, what I'm willing to discuss with y'all today is the Coast Guard's contribution to World War II, specifically D-Day, from the perspective of one person. So As you know, the Coast Guard was pretty active during World War II, and these are some of their biggest known contributions. First of all, we had close to 250,000 men and women. That's a far cry from what we have serving today, so a lot more. But yep, we had about 230,000 men and women serving. Some of their main roles were piloting the landing craft for infantry and vehicles, shipping convoy escort, search and rescue of downed airmen, aerial search and attack of U-boats, especially along the U.S. coastline, and beach and security patrols. And so some of the more well-known ones, Signalman First Class Douglas Monroe and BM2 Ray Evans won a Medal of Honor and Navy Cross, respectively, for their actions in the evacuation of Marines off Guadalcanal, 42. We had BM2 John Cullen. He was the lucky beach patrolman who ran across the German saboteurs coming ashore in New York. Caught him, reported him, and as a result were apprehended and they were tried and dealt with. We had Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Cowart. He was on board the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Campbell when they attacked and eventually rammed the U-606, resulting in its sinking. He was awarded the Silver Star due to him not only taking charge of the gun mounts on the ship as it attacked, but also saved the ship from sinking from the damage it sustained after it rammed the U-boat. He eventually retired as a vice admiral. Is this better? All right, thank you. Finally, the subject of my discussion today is Commander Quentin Walsh. It's a very interesting character who kind of led a non-traditional Coast Guard mission, started around D-Day. But some background information on Commander Walsh is that he grew up and joined the Army. He didn't come straight into the Coast Guard. So he joined the Army National Guard and then got accepted to the Coast Guard Academy and graduated there in 1933. He was most known during the academy for being an aggressive boxer and a real go-getter. So after graduation from the academy, he became an ensign, served on 2 cutters, and his biggest pre-war contribution is serving as an observer with the whaling fleet. So basically what he'd do is embed himself in with some of the industrial whalers and just kind of monitor what they were doing, how they did business, and some of his insight and observations led to some of the more significant whaling laws, a lot of which are still on the books today. So he already made a name for himself before the war even began. So basically, after World War II started, they sent him to England and to start planning for the invasion of France. It was known pretty early on that the key to victory was to open up as many fronts as possible against the Germans, and an invasion of northern France was going to be key to that. So as it came closer, as things were turning against the Germans, they were looking toward like late 1943 of opening up that northern French front. So they tasked Commander Walsh there to not only gather intel and come up with plans for the eventual invasion, but also gather a group of folks, train them, and lead them from the beaches to liberate and basically reestablish the ports in northern France. So, as you know, any offensive requires a solid line of logistics, and paramount to that is the opening of ports and getting the supplies heading to the men that needed them to keep the offensive moving. So basically, once they started the plans for their landing, it was told that they needed to get some Seabees. They got 52 Seabees and 2 Coast Guard officers, and they were trained by 13 Army officers for their landing. Basically, the training was supposed to be really rough, rigorous. They were trained in everything from land nav to small arms, demolition, basically everything that you'd need to really do some hurting. So the basic plan was to go on the 4th day after the landing, so that would be like the 10th of June, to land and make way to Cherbourg with the 7th Army Corps to secure, reestablish the harbor facilities. The key one was Cherbourg. So the path, the path to Cherbourg wasn't easy. Even though they landed on the 4th day after, there was still plenty of hardships. First of all, the weather conditions were miserable. Right after the landings, there was tons of rain. It was relentless rain, wind, and they were pretty much slogging it through the entire way with uncovered jeeps. They were soaked, their ammo, everything was wet, soaked to the bone. So they finally entered Cherbourg on the 27th of June. The city was still under artillery attack, and there were significant pockets of resistance still remaining. So after fighting through the port, they finally saw the facilities, and the Germans that were holed up in the area were ordered to not let the port fall into Allied hands. So they did everything they could to not only booby trap the heck out of it, but to destroy everything that they could to make it as unusable, inoperable as possible. So as they were moving forward to secure the various components of the port, there were Germans that embedded themselves into fortified bunkers or areas of destroyed equipment, whatever, and their job was to harass and keep the Seabees and the Coast Guardsmen from doing their jobs, and they were pretty effective with it. So after a few days of stiff fighting, they finally came upon a bunker where they actually liberated 53 American paratroopers that were captured and being held. And after some more fighting, they eventually captured about 750 German officers and men. So with most of the fighting and whatnot over, it was now the role of the Coast Guardsmen and the Seabees to rapidly restore services as soon as possible to the port. So it wasn't just as simple as turning on some switches. As you can see, piers, infrastructure pretty much destroyed. So they had to rapidly replace equipment and get things running as soon as possible. And that was slowed down by the presence of hidden mines, booby traps, and explosives, occasional snipers still. So after Cherbourg was stood up, Commander Walsh was ordered to kind of take control of the port and oversee the administration of the facilities. So, but the offensive didn't stop. So there were plans to move along the coastline of France, liberate more ports, get them back in operation, more paths of logistics to go through. Yet the captain in charge, there's another Coast Guard captain in charge to kind of do similar operations. They were ambushed, and a lot of folks were killed. So that mission was ended for the short while. Commander Walsh was so successful with his operation that he was tasked, and he again took the offensive with Seabees and was able to liberate several other ports. So as you can see there, he early August ordered to capture the ports at Saint-Malo and Le Havre. At the end of the war for Commander Walsh was the 17th of September. He contracted some sort of lung infection, and so basically medical boarded out. He returned to the United States shortly thereafter, where he was awarded the Navy Cross for his contributions to that effect. And that's his citation photo of him receiving the award there. So he was one of only 6 Navy Crosses presented to Coast Guard members during the war. The other was, earlier in the slideshow, was Ray Evans, who was with Sigelman First Class Douglas Monroe, who won the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal. I am so sorry. Is that better? And so Commander Walsh's post-war career, he was medically retired and recalled to service in 1951, where he continued to serve until 1960. He eventually died of illnesses related to his wartime service on the 18th of May, 2000. And that's, went through it a little faster than I thought. Like I said, I wouldn't. So, but I appreciate you and thank you for your time. And I'm sorry if I was hard to hear.
like to thank all three of our panelists this afternoon, and I know that this is a couple of subject matters that you wonder, what are they thinking, trying to string together three things that seem very disparate off the top of your head. You know, when you think about, though, D-Day and the conventional narrative of attacking the beaches on June the 6th, 1944, it's true, you don't usually think about stories about African Americans, French commandos, or the Coast Guard. And what I think is interesting about these panelists and the presentations they've give is that they're talking about outsiders in a way. And that's one of the consistent themes, but the other consistent theme, I thought, as I listened, was resistance in a certain way for all of these three groups. And the one other theme that also kind of leaps out to me that I think is very consistent with this is that D-Day is not just June the 6th. It's a campaign. It's the first day of something that's much larger that has to go on, and that's where these contributions become so important. And so I thought I would start by asking, Paul, why don't I ask you down at the end first, and you can pull the microphone out. I don't know if you're aware of this, but speaking of outsiders, had you ever run across anything with John Ford that Linda mentioned earlier, the Hollywood director, in your research?
No, I have not.
Okay. I just thought I'd kind of go on a fishing mission there, but what I was interested in was that what you were talking about with Commander Walsh there and the trying to deal with Cherbourg. Could you talk a little bit more about, this is something that a lot of people don't really think about with the Coast Guard, but what sort of things were required to secure that port? And also, do you know if the Coast Guard ever did anything with the mulberries that the British built, the fake ports that were also, you know, part of Normandy that today you can still visit at Arromanches?
So basically, what you were asking me is if, so what did the, could you ask that part again? There was a lot of questions in one.
Could you talk a little bit more about the importance of the Coast Guard and the taking of these ports, permanent ports?
Okay, so the reason why it was important for the Coast Guard to go in and take these ports is, number one, the Coast Guard's the experts when it comes to not only the management, but also the operation and security of ports. So that's one of the Coast Guard key missions, or key roles, even today. So with him leading it, it wasn't so much about him being a combatant, being like Lee Marvin or something like that. It was more of him getting in there and having the ability to defend himself and the operations. And so the reason why they needed the Coast Guard to lead it is the Coast Guard knows best how to set up a port and the type of functions that would need to be restored to get supplies, you know, into the men where they're needed as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. So that's what you're asking, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Dauphine, maybe we make sure that we pull these microphones up a little bit. I was thinking about this because I've read a number of memoirs of French resistance people involved, and what strikes me from Robert de Rochefoucauld to Stephen Grady to Lucy Albrecht, they all have a similar reaction when liberation starts to come. De Gaulle, of course, says we're all in the resistance. Their reaction in all of those memoirs is, where did everybody come from? Did your father experience something similar like that?
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, for him and for most of his friends and comrades, the reaction to the invasion of France was immediate. Of course, we have to do something, and we're not going to wait. And so you just had to find a way to do it. So for him, he had to find a way to go to England. It was not easy. So he finally made his way through Spain and Portugal, spent 3 months in Lisbon working for the British Secret Service, and then finally was able to go to England. So it was not easy. His is just one story. But I remember asking that very question to a very good friend of my parents, Jacqueline Perry, who had been in the French resistance and was arrested by the Gestapo, was taken to the camp of Ravensbrück. And the rest of her life, she spent talking about all of this and trying to educate the young generations about it so that it would not happen again, ever. And so she came to my daughter's high school, to talk to the students. And I asked her that question. I said, how did you know what to do and how to do it? And she said, I was 18 years old, but I knew right away. There was no question. And I asked her, did you hear the appeal from de Gaulle? And she said, no, didn't hear it, but heard word of mouth, and it was obvious reaction. So for them to then come back to France and find what the situation was really, sometimes was very depressing. And in fact, my parents moved out of France. They came to the US for a number of years because he couldn't stand staying there for, during this period of it was a very difficult period right after the war. And these, difficulties with people who had fought, who started fighting later, and, this was not a good atmosphere. So it's definitely a good question.
Linda, let me ask you, on that theme of post-war depression, we saw a little bit of that with some of the men that you were talking about there. I was wondering if you could, on the specific case of Mr. Woodsen, discuss do you know anything about why he wasn't upgraded with the Clinton administration's reevaluation of the medals in the 90s?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Why wasn't he? So the report that I mentioned was commissioned by the Army, an independent panel, to examine why no African Americans were awarded the Medal of Honor in World War II. There were more than 1 million African Americans who served. And the report's an extraordinary report. It's in book form. You can read it. And it tells a tale of shame for those of us who hold our military up to a certain standard. It tells a story of race hatred and discrimination built into the core of the Army. And there was an obvious effort, to right that wrong with this report and with giving out 7 of those Medals of Honor. Waverly Woodsen was not given one. There were a few others as well, and that was because their medals, the medals trail is missing. We don't have records. The Army does not want to set precedents, and so the slip of paper I found, those researchers also found that slip of paper. It's hearsay. It's not enough. The Army's own press release from August of 1944 singling out that soldier on Omaha Beach, Waverly Woodsen, for his deeds, was extraordinary. That the Army would put out a press release for an African-American medic who was wounded in the landing and cite his deeds was extraordinary, but it's not enough. It's not enough that he was a star of his day. It's not enough that he was on radio programs from coast to coast. It's not enough that the African-American press called him our #1 invasion hero. There's not a records trail. Those records are gone. And with that comes the campaign underway today. It wasn't for a few decades that Waverly Woodsen learned that he'd been nominated around the time of that report, which was commissioned in 1995. And so he was also quite grateful to the French government. One story I didn't mention is that in 1995, or 1994, he was received by the French government in Normandy with 2 other American vets. They were given a palm-sized medal commemorating their service in Normandy. He was very proud to be there, very proud. And he died not ever expecting to get our nation's highest honor, but still extremely proud. And he gave lots and lots of interviews on the 50th anniversary of D-Day where he recounts how proud he was of his service and how proud he was of that medal that the French government awarded him.
One other thing, Linda, to follow up on very quickly that kind of caught my attention, I was hoping you could expand on. Off the top, you talked about how these balloons were kind of a secret technology, specialized at this time. Given the fact that the U.S. military was segregated, how did the 320th come to this duty?
That is the question. That is an excellent question. We don't know. There's no memo that exists that says, why was this battalion picked for the Normandy campaign? We don't know. I theorize as to why I think they were perhaps picked. Those of you who are World War II buffs have certainly heard of the First Lady, and you probably have heard that Eleanor Roosevelt was very active in ensuring that black soldiers who had been relegated to lesser roles in the First and Second World Wars, whose combat positions had been taken away from them as they had been relegated to service work. Very important service work, but still, they did not have the same stature that they had earlier in our nation's history, in a history of wars. And she, along with the pressure groups at the time, which would later be called civil rights groups, and along with some Democratic congressmen, were pushing for black soldiers to have more responsibility. So we can make a case that it was perhaps because of that that an African-American unit was picked to go on the Normandy campaign, but we don't know.
Dauphine, if I can come back to you for a moment. Sure. One of the images you showed, I used to actually show when I was a college professor before I took this job, and it is of the Paris Exposition in 1937. And you didn't mention this, but in that image you can see the Soviet pavilion squared off against the Nazi pavilion. Mm-hmm. And I found it kind of interesting that your parents had attended this. I was wondering, did they ever talk about this? Did they ever tour those expos? What were their thoughts?
I'm sorry, I really cannot answer that question. I mean, I remember my mother was completely, flabbergasted by this exposition. I mean, it was amazing, but I don't remember her telling me about, the Nazi and the Soviet pavilion. So for her, it was all art. It was not so political. And yeah, I was only 18 when my father died, so I didn't have that many adult conversations with him, and certainly no conversations about the war. Basically, everything I know through my mother. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, I was thinking about this, and as you point out, your father, I was going to ask, what did he talk about? And I'd like to ask this of all three of the panelists and their experiences dealing with World War II veterans. I've had separate conversations with you all about this theme a little bit, except for Paul, but in your experiences, your father painted. What did he say?
So once again, my experience is different from that of my siblings. So I'm number 6 in my family, with 15 years difference with the oldest child. If you ask that same question to my siblings, they would say, yeah, he told us a lot of stories, and some of them we would have rather not listened to. He told a lot of stories to my mother. By the time I came along, there were no more stories to be told because he had told them already. He wanted to tell them, but my siblings would come between me saying, I didn't hear it, I'd like to hear it, saying, shut up. And then they would explain to me that it wasn't just that they didn't want to hear those stories, a millionth time, but it was mostly because it made my father very upset. Whenever he talked about the war, or whenever maybe there was a movie on television about the war, it made him extremely upset. And so they were trying to prevent these crises from happening. So speaking was difficult. He wanted to do it, but he wasn't always allowed to do it. But the painting, he could do whatever he wanted. And as you will see if you see the exhibit, he's doing it in his way, and sometimes he's hiding what he's really expressing behind abstract art. Sometimes it's easy to see, sometimes it's not abstract at all. I showed you a few of these paintings that are very realistic and very difficult to look at. There are at least 2 or 3 like that. Others, you can sort of guess what's there. Others, you really can't. So. That's his expression.
I was starting to tell Linda about this right before we started, and Linda, you were telling me about a woman you had interviewed, a daughter of one of the veterans, who didn't know anything about her father's service. Could you?
There were a few children who didn't know their fathers were at D-Day until I came knocking on the door. I will tell you that my father, who was in the South Pacific in the U.S. Navy in World War II, he died in 1997. I asked him no questions about his war service. And if you don't think I regret that, all the time. When I interviewed these men, I was in a very privileged position. I was a reporter coming, I live in France, I was coming to interview them. It was a big deal. A lot of them, everybody was gracious. A lot of them who had not told these stories before told me, because I was coming from a great distance and they were gracious, gracious souls, but also because why? They were ready to talk. They were in their 90s. And they were more emotional when you would bring up these stories than they were, you know, for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, say. Only one of them was the go-to VFW guy in Pittsburgh, the one I mentioned who's still alive. He was the only one who was known in the media in his town as the D-Day veteran. The others all had a very low profile. Even William Dabney, who for the 65th anniversary in 2009 got the Legion of Honor in France. When I spoke at the African American Museum in Roanoke, Virginia with him, the mayor was there. The mayor had no idea that there was a veteran who received the French Legion of Honor and who had done any of this. So they were very, very closed-mouthed about their experiences. And I will just add one more thing about that. The big difference here when you're dealing with African-American men is, and many of them told me this, they just did not think that the deeds of black men were important or were valuable. It is a very, very sore point among African-American veterans in this country that Saving Private Ryan shows no black men on those beaches, but shows their balloons. And it is a very, very sore point. Or the man that John Ford, you know, all of the port battalions, the quartermasters, the stevedores, the ones unloading those ships under relentless fire that whole day and after. It's a sore point.
Paul, let me ask you this, and I'll frame it this way. The Coast Guard's role, not just on D-Day, but in World War II, is perhaps unknown and underappreciated by much of the public. But the Coast Guard was protecting our shorelines all this time. Let me ask you, what do you think was the greatest achievement of the Coast Guard in World War II?
Me personally?
Yes, as a historian.
I think personally, I think the greatest, well, the most significant service the Coast Guard did during World War II is help defeat the German U-boats. The U-boats had a devastating impact on merchant traffic going and supporting the war in Europe. And basically, England was on the verge of falling because of it. And I think that for this reason, the Coast Guard and its ability to track down and stop the U-boats was the most significant contribution.
I'm looking for my colleagues, and I don't know if we have a microphone out there, but I would like to open up some questions from the audience for our panelist. Yes, ma'am.
Well, yes, ma'am. I think that the biggest roles that I'm aware of, I haven't researched the Gulf of Mexico specifically, but would be the counter U-boat lookouts and also the patrols, escort services of the merchant vessels. I mean, remember reading that merchant vessels were getting hit right off the coast. They could see the fires and, you know, from the burning ships right from the beach. So the Coast Guard's ability to, you know, track down, you know, locate U-boats from the air, from the sea, and stop them. I think that Gulf Coast, I think that's the biggest relevance. Yes, ma'am, thank you.
I'll try and repeat the question, sir, so that everybody can hear your question.
Makes it easier.
On the balloons.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, was any statistics kept on the number of the German planes that were downed by doing that?
No, and the reason for that is it was very hard to determine at night when a lot of these attacks took place which were due to balloons hiding in the clouds and which was due to being shot down. We do know that this unit, and I talk about it in Chapter 9, we do know that this unit was credited with taking out some planes. You will also know, I'm sure, as D-Day buffs here, that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was much depleted, much more depleted than the Allies expected. And so while they did launch a serious air campaign after, in the days after D-Day, it was not the campaign that was expected that could have been absolutely devastating to the men on the ground. And so while they were deemed highly, highly effective at keeping the men safe, because a beach is the perfect area for these balloons, whereas the city of London, which was protected by barrage balloons, not as effective, too large an area. A targeted area, the perfect ground for these balloons to protect. And so we do know that they were effective, and in the Italian campaign they were deemed so effective that is why they were rolled out for the Normandy campaign. But no statistics, no.
Please raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you. Over here on the left.
I'm interested in Guy de Montlaur. Did he exhibit in commercial galleries, or was his art private art?
Or was his art?
Did he exhibit in fine art galleries, or was his art?
Did he exhibit in galleries to be,
Oh, yes.
his art to be sold, or was it just a private art?
Yes, so during his lifetime, he did exhibit in art galleries. Some pieces were acquired by museums. A few of the pieces that are here belong to some museums in France. And there have been a lot of exhibits, even in the last 10 years or so. But in the last 10 years, it's been mostly in war-related museums.
Ready? Okay, thank y'all three for being here. I've really learned a lot from y'all. I was curious about your book. How did you get an interest in that subject matter, and plus, how did you begin your research?
That's to me? Yeah. That's a great question. Well, I was a reporter on the 65th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy, and looking for stories, looking for an interesting angle, and it became easy when we were told that the French government was only paying tribute to one American that year, and it was William Garfield Dabney of Roanoke, Virginia. And so I spoke with Bill, who was with his son Vinny. He got the Legion of Honor at a ceremony at Invalides, the French temple of all things military, where Napoleon is buried under the gold dome. And Bill shook the hands of Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, and he had no idea who they were at all, until Vinny said later, "Do you know who they were?" And we all liked that story. And then we loved Bill, the reporters. He was a wonderful man, just died last December. And he told us stories. He told us about these crazy balloons. We thought, wait, what? Balloons were protecting men and they had bombs? And I wondered if, I thought, could he be remembering that wrong? I've never heard of such a story. And then he told us about the Army being segregated, and he told us about their training camp, and he told us about how it was very dangerous for them to leave the camp. And reporters were fascinated because As buffs of World War II, you may know that the U.S. Army was segregated, but we did not, and this was news to us. And so when I wrote about them for the New York Daily News, I thought it was a shame to just do one story, and I checked with a friend, and I wondered if there was a magazine that might want more on these men. And a friend who works for a magazine said, well, you know, you have a book. And I thought, well, I don't know I have a book. I mean, I don't even know, I've never written a book. And so it was very hard to get records. And I'll tell you the hardest thing, and my author's note tells you how difficult it was. My acknowledgments is a sort of a tick-tock chronology story of how I did the research. I love acknowledgments in books. I read them first in nonfiction. And so I wanted to write a good one that told a story. And it's a treasure hunt, really. And so I will tell you the hardest thing to find was a U.S. Army roster. There were not names of the men in the battalion in the records that were at the National Archives in College Park, where the World War II records sit. But you know, reporters are told to go after the money trail, and you know what? The financial records are often there. And so in St. Louis, Missouri, in the personnel records, we requested payroll records, and it was through payroll records that we found names. And I was very lucky. I had a very good researcher who was helping me look up all these names, and we would just look them up and make calls and hope that home phone numbers weren't disconnected and that we could find them. And so that was the start. And the rest of it, it took 5 years beginning to end, and I lay it out in the book if you want to know more. But it was not easy, but I'm glad I was able to do it. I feel a privilege to have written about these men.
Dauphine, your father expressed his feelings about the war through his art. And you mentioned that your mother also was studying art. That's how they met. Did she likewise express her experiences of the war through art? And how did it differ from a female versus male perspective, or someone on the home front versus in the actual throes of the war?
Yeah, that's a very good question. My mother was very good, very talented in her art, but she did not pursue it. She did for pleasure, she did for us. She would illustrate little stories. She did all of our baby books and their beautiful illustrations. But her main job was to be, support of my father. He needed a lot of support. And in fact, he, again, in his writings, we find words where he says, if she hadn't been around, I probably wouldn't be around. I wouldn't have lived that long. So her role was extremely important. And, I started my talk with the word courage, and courage, of course, of all these men who fought, be they sort of ordinary, normal, or be they outsiders, like the three types of people that we've talked about today. They all had courage, but their partners, their spouses, their wives also had to have a lot of courage. So her life was not easy. His life was not easy after the war. We didn't really talk about the impact, the emotional impact, and the physical impact of the war on these men. Linda did some, I didn't, because it's very hard to express, and again, it's very much in the paintings, some of which I showed, but that is what my mother had to deal with every day. And she talks about the nightmares in that little broadcast, and there were those, and there were just the very difficulty of everyday life. So if one would ask her, what about you? Don't you want to pursue your own? She would say, oh, no, the artist, Guy is the artist, not me. Thank you.
Last question.
Hi. And thank you for taking time to talk to us about everything with your father and all of the hardships that he's been through. How would you say the importance of art is in supporting veterans and people who have seen combat handle the stresses of what they've seen once they come home?
I think it's very important, and I think, in a way, I'm very grateful to the World War II Museum, because that is what they saw with this exhibit. It's not just a museum of history, it's a museum of the present and of the future. And I think they saw in my father's story something that might be able to help today's veterans, and there are many of these young men and women who are suffering from physical and psychological impact of the war. And so there are many ways to deal with this. And I'm 100% sure that art is certainly a big help. If you have that, talent or that possibility, I wouldn't. I can't, hold a pen only to write. But, some people have that talent or can develop that talent. Music is another way. Writing is another way. There are many ways of dealing with these experiences, and maybe they can act as therapy. For my father, I don't know, because I was never able to talk about that with him, and he probably wouldn't have liked to talk about it anyway. But I'm sure that it helped with the stress. And again, waking up with these nightmares and going either to his writing or going to his canvas and putting it all there was extremely helpful. So yes, definitely, I think that would be very helpful for contemporary veterans. Thank you for your question.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking all of our panelists. And don't forget that we have these booklets over here on your way out. Thank you.